wrapping it. That hurts. I mean, that's. Are you still limping? Good. You may what? Take this up with that. You know, I started using that other stuff. Then I take my drops and you're not allowed to. Because it's tossing the stuff. He doesn't even realize, even though it's still in there, it's in the shower, and everything.
Does anyone not have the schedule, the reading schedule for this class? Stephen, you don't have one? Everybody else? So what I decided to do in this class, I'm not going to assign questions for each one, but we'll stay with the reading, and really the assumption of each of these lessons is going to be, we'll look at the reading for this week, look at the parables, and think about the characters, what's represented, what find that message, that one point that Jesus is trying to make, or maybe there is more than one point in that particular message. And thinking about what kind of parable it is. We're not talking, you don't have to get academic, but just think in terms of, I mean, is he just trying to make an analogy between the different aspects of this particular story, or is he just really trying to set the mood and get you to understand the end point and how the story resolves itself, and how is he trying to teach a lesson in that parable, and because that's going to help in terms of understanding, is this one that we need to dig into and really parse it out and think about all these different elements of the parable, or is it really more about understanding how the character gets from here to here, and what the end result of that is, if that all makes sense. Hopefully it will, as we keep talking about this. Next week we'll be in Luke 15, and we'll be talking about parables related to seeking the lost. But for now, let's go ahead and finish up in Luke 12. We'll talk a little bit more specifically. We talked about the passage in general. Let me skip through a lot of this. The We talked in general about the chapter in the context of what was going on. Oh, there we go. And as you remember, as we talked about this, you can kind of see what's going on throughout the course of this context and how all the parables are related to each other. And all this starts out in the very beginning. If you remember, he's talking about influence and persecution for the cause of Christ, and what's going to happen as a result of all of those things. And in the middle of that, of course, the man chimes in and says, "Tell me, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And so the idea is you've got people who are supposed to be focused on doing what God's called them to do and performing their service and their work as servants of God in the kingdom, and they're still focused on things of this world, finances, money, inheritance, all the things that this life has to offer. And as a result of that, he tells them the story of the rich fool. And the idea, and of course, the point of the rich fool was what? Well, he did. He certainly did that. Yeah, he's more concerned with that than with spiritual things. And in fact, the issue seems to be that his satisfaction, his contentment was in the idea that I've addressed my physical needs and I've got beyond what I don't ever have to worry or think about my physical needs anymore. And now I'm satisfied. There's nothing else. And of course, the response of the Lord is, you fool, this night your soul is required of you. And what good will these be? So you've been spending all this time, you put all this effort, and you trusted in something that is not going to help you beyond this life. And so we've got the story of the rich fool, and so he goes on and talks about, as we said, some of the talk, the idea of treasuring up for yourself, laying up for yourself treasures in heaven. He doesn't use those languages, but it's that language, but it's the same kind of discussion that we see in the Sermon on the Mount. because he uses that same idea, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And that's what gets us into the parable, whatever you want to call it. I don't know if there's a name, the vigilant servant, in verse 35. And that's kind of where I want to start a little bit today. In verse 35, let's see, keep going. There we go. Or the watchful servant's what I called it. And so he says, beginning in verse 35, stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning, and be like men who are waiting for their masters to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them. If he comes in the second watch or in the third watch and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. But know this, that if the master of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour when you don't expect. So, what the key phrase here, and how I'm going to interpret this passage, and how I'm going to apply it to my life. In verse 36, what does he tell them? Well, he does in verse. He says that in verse 35. In 36, what's the parallel here?
Be ready like men waiting for their master.
Yeah, be like these men. All right, so that's the takeaway. I need to see, all right, what are these men like? What characterizes them? And that should kind of tell you automatically that the point probably here is not to say that I need to go look at every aspect of this parable and figure out what it all means. Now, there's obviously there are some meanings and there's some symbolism here, but the point is you need to understand who these people were and how they treated their service to this master, and you emulate that. You have that kind of that kind of mindset, right? Um, and it's interesting that when you look at this, what is it that causes them? What marks them as being blessed? What ultimately do they need to accomplish?
Being awake and ready.
Yeah, being awake and ready. It's interesting, by the way. This is again a good example of probably where you don't dig too much into a parable, because if you'll notice, the whole point of having the what's the whole point of the master putting the servants in the house while he's gone? What's the reason for them being there is what? To watch after, to make sure what? Yeah, the thief. I want to make sure the thief doesn't come in. And so, and it's interesting that I heard some commentaries that said that the main thing about these houses at that time was that typically what you would do if you're a thief to break into a house, this wasn't you going and picking a lock and doing things. This was you would either have to dig under the wall or break through the roof. Those are things that you can't really do in secret. Yeah, when somebody's there, you can't really do it. And so the idea is, I need somebody that basically I need a house sitter, and I need you there to make sure that the guy doesn't say, "Well, there's nobody there, nobody will stop me." And so it's interesting to me that the goal is not to stop the thief, so that when the thief comes, you can overpower him. The point is, you just need to be ready and be here. And I don't. You might argue that maybe there's a subtle lesson there as well, but he makes the point that you got to be there, but to be there, you have to be alert. Because if, what are the two things that he mentions in verse 35? He gives them two commands: stay dressed and keep your lamps burning. Do you notice, by the way, the parable doesn't start until verse 36? He says this in verse 35. Is this is stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning? Obviously, he's not saying this literally, right? But isn't that pretty typical of the language that Jesus uses really throughout the gospel?
You can't really separate it out though, because
Mhm.
at the end it's not here. So it is part.
Well, yeah, it's an example of what that's going to look like, right? Uh, yes, go ahead. Okay. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. And when you think about this, does that make you think of any other passages, by the way? Let's look at the two things that he tells them to do here. First of all, you need to stay dressed. Well, what's implied in that?
Girding your loins.
Okay, yeah. In fact, that's the literal translation, right? Girding.
You take your long skirt and bring it up between your legs and tuck it in your belts.
Mhm.
And now it looks more like shovels than you.
Yeah. In other words, it's not just about you need to stay dressed, and so if you get up, in the middle of the night, you have clothes on. It's the idea that you are prepared to do something. And that's that idea. There's the implication of not only staying prepared to be able to protect and do whatever you need to do in the event you're called to act. You're prepared to act in those examples. Um, the language there, and it's the same phrase that Peter uses over in 1 Peter 1, verse 13. If you look over there where Peter writes, therefore, preparing your minds for action. That's the same phrase, preparing your minds. That's girding up. It literally is translated, gird up the loins of your mind. And being sober minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. You think about that analogy, and again, it's a parable. It's a parable from the standpoint that it's a symbolic concept, but Jesus uses this phrase all the time, and they would have understood what it meant. That idea of when I gird up the loins of my mind, when I prepare myself for action, I'm setting my hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. When you think about, how I might be dressed uh, in that day, I've got my robe, I've got everything, and it may very well be even that if I've got some sort of a station in life, maybe my clothes are relatively good, and I want to make sure that I'm looking a certain way. We can obviously relate to that when I take my robe and bunch it up around my leg and do that, am I real focused on what I look like at that point? Probably not.
So
Hmm.
what we could say is that we're getting rid of those encumbrances,
Hmm.
those things that would get in the way
Yeah.
of us being able to love and do that with ourselves.
Yeah. And you're not worried about anything else. Your prime focus is I need to make sure that I'm dressed in such a way that I can do what I need to do. I'm no longer worried about, well, that's not really how this garment is supposed to be worn. Somebody's going to look at me funny and think that I'm not really putting myself together. David and back to Laura. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There's that idea again, and it goes back to that idea of encumbrance. If my life depends on it, I don't want to wear anything that's going to keep me or impede my movement that's going to help me to defend or to attack. Lark, good. No, it's okay. So that idea of dress for action, and we see this language all the time. And the second image that he gives there is what?
So in that platform,
Yeah, yeah. He says, stay dressed for action, and what? And keep your lamps burning. Um, it's similar idea, but it's not exactly the same. When we think about keeping our lamps burning, and again, Jesus uses the analogy of a lamp all the time. What is he talking about here? Why do I need to keep my lamp burning? Okay, so that others can see. It, I guess you can make an argument that that might be relevant here too. Uh, I suspect that what he means here probably more is so that I can see. If I'm keeping a lamp burning at night, what am I? It's like me having a flashlight.
bring it in the context of the parable.
Hmm.
So the thief can't break in and steal.
Yeah.
We've all heard all the news stories.
Hmm.
Thieves will walk along the street and
Yeah.
lights on, no.
Hmm.
Lights off, that's
Yep. There's two aspects. There's that whole thing. We'll leave the light on for you. The idea that we know somebody's home. There's definitely an aspect of that. There's also the idea that if I need to get up to check on something in the middle of the night, I need to be able to see what I'm doing. So there's this idea of being visible, being able to see, and that's pretty typical again of how what kind of vigilance this is. If I only need to be vigilant during the day, do I really need to have my lamp on? Probably not. I can just let it go. The point is, and he makes this point in the second watch or the third watch. I think we mentioned this. Typically, the night would be divided up into watches, meaning that you'd have sentries on duty for this part, and then this part, and then this part. And so the second or the third watch, basically meaning dark until I think it's probably 2 or 3 in the morning, and then the third watch until the break of dawn. In other words, if you got to be up all night and paying attention to what's going on, you need to be found waiting. Hmm.
If we contrast this with the virgins,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
humble,
Hmm.
attentive to your life to make sure that you are still have to make sure
Yeah, I think that's obviously implied. You've got to be able to do all that. Again, I don't think that's the point of this parable, but you're right. But you're right. And when we get into the parable of the 10 virgins, that's exactly the point that he's going to make. That if you're not ready to get up in the middle of the night with your lamps and go out and do what you need to do, then what's the point of having a lamp to begin with? If you can't use it. It reminded me. Look over First Thessalonians chapter 5. You mentioned you talked earlier, David, about the implications for the church, and I think you're right because the same language is used over and over again. And we'll talk a little bit about the audience of this parable in a minute. But there's no question that even though Jesus, I don't think, is specifically talking about the entire church right here, there's a way in which this is relevant for us as well. It's the same kind of idea, and he uses the same analogy. And maybe he had this parable in mind when he said this. In verse 1 of chapter 5, First Thessalonians, he says, "Now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you, for you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying there is peace and security, then suddenly destruction will come upon them. As labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, they will not escape. But you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light, children of the day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation." You, it's almost like he's taking that parable that Jesus just gave us and recasting it. And I think he uses it, at least I suspect, that he's making a slightly different application, but ultimately the message is the same. You need to be prepared. When Paul talks about being in the light, what's he talking about? Sorry? Okay. Okay. Well, I think it's the same idea. Yeah. Um,
living the Christian life.
yeah.
Every action and thought considers part of our life first.
Yeah. And I think those mostly kind of say the same thing, but in different ways. The idea, he says, you are not in darkness. In other words, that's not the life you lead. So he's going to use light in a little bit of a different way. I think Jesus is talking about it in terms of preparation, in terms of being able to see. Paul's talking about it in terms of this is how you need to live your life. The people that want to be in darkness, the reason they're in darkness is because people can't see what they're doing, because they want to have the concealment of darkness. He says, we're not of the night or of the darkness in verse 6. So then let us not sleep as others do. Let us keep awake and be sober. Now, I will make this point because what will happen is we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next parable. But when we think about the message, he says in verse 39, back in the parable, back in Luke 12, "But know this, if the master of the house had known what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." So when we think about the Son, when you think about when somebody tells you, or when you read a passage that says the coming of the Son of Man, what typically do you think of? The second coming. Okay. How else might it be used, or how else do we see it used in Scripture? Destruction. Hmm. Yeah, the destruction of the temple, which was essentially an act of what? Judgment. Which, and again, the second coming in judgment. There's pretty similar concepts there, right? Uh, and there's different ways that you can use this passage or that phrase, "Son of Man." And I think Paul, in his passage in First Thessalonians, it seems a lot more clear what he's talking about there. He seems very clearly talking about the idea of the day of the Lord when we're going to be called to account. We're going to this world is going to be ended. We're going to be called to the judgment. Now, it's very possible, and it very well be that that's what he's talking about, that Jesus is talking about back in the parable. We're not told that. And the reason I bring that up is you have to be careful to remember that rule that the parable is its own universe. Just because that phrase is used somewhere else in that way doesn't necessarily mean that it's used exactly the same way. Now, in this case, it doesn't really make a lot of difference. When we think about what it might mean, the idea of the second coming, the final judgment, whether it be the destruction of Jerusalem, whether it be, what was the judgment day for the rich fool? His death. Uh, the day that he individually, I would argue that no matter what it is, it always boils down to that. Ultimately, this is the day in which you will be called into account for what you've done. And again, he'll use a second parable later on to really talk more about that. But I have to be careful not to cross pollinate the parables. Again, they are different stories, but it's the same basic idea that if the master shows up in the third watch, well, the house isn't going to be broken into, but what is he going to find? Well, you weren't really ready. There's no reason thief could have just come up here. He never would have known you were here because your light's not off, and you're over here in bed not paying attention to anything. You know, did I accomplish my goal? You know, that's a great example of where Jesus makes the point. Your goal is not to make sure the thief doesn't break in. You can't say, well, got it. Look, everything worked out. Thief didn't break in. All your stuff is here. It's okay. Well, yeah, but your job was to stay awake, and your job was to be vigilant, and you weren't. And so that's kind of the message that we see. And in the context, again, of what we've been talking about, what does staying vigilant look like? When I just told you that you need to stop worrying about the things of this life and get focused on the kingdom. That's that idea that you need to, like you said, remove those things that are a hindrance to you, the things that are causing you and distracting you and keeping you from focusing on what you need to be worried about, which is staying awake and staying alert. So it's at this point that Peter chimes in uh, and he asks the question, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? And the charitable way to interpret that is for Peter. Look, Peter is diligently thinking about this. He's already been told, look, we're going to have to teach this to others. I need to understand this. Does this apply to these people out here? Because if you notice, we already talked about the fact that Luke has made a distinction between him speaking to the disciples first, and later on, we're going to see in this passage that Jesus will turn. It's over in verse 54, it says he also said to the crowds. So there's some ambiguity about who's being discussed here. There's the big crowds out there, but the disciples are close. And so Peter hears this and goes, does that apply to them too? Now, the less charitable part of me, I think that Peter always seems to be the one that chimes in. Well, what about that guy? Lord, we've left all, you talked about this guy. Well, we've left everything. What do we get? When he sees John, well, Lord, is he going to die like I am? There's always a little bit of that. Well, what about them? And so I tend to think that may be what he's talking about. Look, you're telling us that we need to be vigilant and we need to be alert. Well, how about all those people out around us? And I suspect that's what he's talking about. Now, does Jesus answer that question? Not directly. Would you say that he does it indirectly? How so? Or do you? Well, I mean, that's fine. It's okay. I thought you might have an idea on that. It is. He doesn't answer this question directly, but then he. But it's kind of like, and Jesus does this a lot. If you notice, he answers questions by setting up a scenario that forces you to answer the question for yourself. You remember skipping ahead to the parable of the Good Samaritan. What was the whole premise? Why did he even tell that parable to begin with? What question prompted it? Who's my neighbor? Jesus never answers that question. But what he does is, all right, I'm going to tell you a story, and I want you to think about this story. And at the end of the time, did you really feel like you needed to ask me that question at all? And I think that's kind of what Jesus is doing here. He gives this parable in beginning in verse 42 because he says, "Who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom his master will set over his household to give them their portion of food at the proper time?" That's kind of an interesting thing. Well, I'll finish the parable and we'll come back to that. Blessed is that servant whom his master will find doing so when he comes. He's kind of reiterating the same point that he's made earlier. You were given a job, and you'll be blessed if the master comes home and sees that you're doing it. Verse 44, truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant says to himself, my master's delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. I'm going to stop there for a minute. So now the addition is made to the idea that he was giving in this first parable, that we already said the servant who's found waiting and ready and doing what he's supposed to do is going to be blessed. And Jesus makes that point. And we didn't, I guess I alluded to this last week. In the first parable, how is that servant going to be blessed when the master finds him waiting and faithful? In that first parable, how is he blessed?
Joining that table, like the master will actually come and serve them.
Yeah. Uh, that's the shock value of this parable. I mentioned that a lot of times. Parables a lot of times will have kind of a shock value. Masters don't serve servants. That's not how that works. And the point there is not that when we get to heaven, Jesus is going to come wait on us. Again, it's a good example. This is not intended to be an analogy, but what it is trying to tell you is that you're going to be blessed as a servant in a way that no servant is ever blessed. The blessing that we're talking about here is abundant, and it is great and deep, and you need to have a full appreciation for it. Now we see the other side of it, because now we're getting into this idea of accountability. And you notice, how is he described in this second parable? What is it that he ought to be doing that would cause him to be faithful, or that would describe him as faithful?
Managing the house wisely, giving the servants their portion of food at the proper time.
Okay, what's the implication here? Earlier it was just about watching the house. Now who's he watching here? The servants, the other servants, the family, probably, his household, anything that's in his household. He is responsible for taking care of. Now, let's go back to Peter's question. Who is this parable for? Is it for us or for them? For everybody. What is the role of the apostles? Dave. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, they all were handed the keys to the kingdom. There's another passage that says they all are. But you're right. That idea that you're going to be given this responsibility. You're going to have a responsibility that, yeah, you're right, Peter. They're not going to have the same responsibility that you have. At least not in this way. How many times we read two passages in Luke and Matthew where it talks about them sitting on the thrones and judging the 12 tribes of Israel. You know, it kind of goes back to exactly what he just said, didn't it? Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom his master will set over his household? Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. If you're faithful, you're going to be judging all of this. You're going to be given this seat of prominence. And when we think about what's involved in that, he talks about judgment, but in John 21, in fact, what was Jesus' admonition to Peter? What was he supposed to be doing? Yes, Simon, do you love me? Well, he does say that later, but what does he say before that? Simon, do you love me? Yes, I love you. Feed my sheep. I actually heard somebody argue that, well, see, there you go. The apostles' job was to make sure that everybody had food. No. In fact, Acts 6 pretty much tells us that's not what he's talking about, although they did have a hand in that. This is clearly talking about the idea that you need to be responsible for the spiritual well being and nourishment of the people over which you have been set. It's you go back and read in Ezekiel and Jeremiah how many times I think we've alluded to some of this in the divided kingdom class. How many times God has an issue with the shepherds of Israel because they were not doing that. They were not feeding the flock. They were using the flock as a way of enriching themselves. And so I think that when you get into this section here where he talks about the unfaithful servant, my master's delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants and eat and drink and get drunk. Who's he kind of describing there? That's the current leadership. I don't know if that's necessarily who he's specifically talking about there, but what he is saying is that this is what a faithful servant looks like. This is what an unfaithful servant looks like. And if you're found doing this, as he says, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. Who's he talking about here? Is he talking about the apostles or are he talking about the crowds? I think that he's immediately talking about the apostles, but is there a sense in which he's talking about everybody? Are there going to be, would you argue that there are groups of people in the Lord's church that have more responsibility than others? I think that's pretty clear, isn't it? What does James say? Don't be many what? Don't be many teachers. Why? Well, yeah, but he says because you'll have a greater condemnation, but you're right. There's more that's going to be expected. In fact, this is kind of the key for this passage and understanding what he says. I'm going to skip over a couple of things because it says in verse 48 at the end, everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required. And from him to whom they entrusted much, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. So, going back to Peter's question again, who's being talked about here? Who was given responsibility? Yeah, the apostles were given responsibility, and later on, that responsibility starts to grow. And frankly, as you said, is there any Christian that has no responsibility, that has no stewardship at all, that has nothing that they've been given under their charge to take care of? You can just see everybody is involved in this. So, Peter, on the one hand, yeah, it is about them, but you've got something much more impressive that you're going to have to deal with, and the standard for you is going to be much higher. Now, and I think this is kind of an important point because as you read this, and I struggle with this a little bit too, and I'm wrong on this, but in verse 47 it says that servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. You can read that and think to yourself, well, is Jesus teaching here that on the day of judgment, well, you are going to get this level of punishment, and you are going to get this level because you really weren't as responsible, and so you'll get a lighter. It's the whole seven rings of hell that in Dante's Inferno.
Well, they both point as see, they both got
Yeah, they both got a beating. Uh,
under the rules of sin. They all separated from God.
yeah,
Yeah, there might get worse.
yeah.
They all separated.
And you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking because we both listened to the same lesson. We listened to a lesson. Stephen Russell did a really good lesson. He and Marshall McDaniel over in Athens did a series of lessons. Yeah, Alabama. I forget. I gotta make that specification. And they talked about the sin of pornography in relationship to marriage, divorce, and remarriage because there is a movement in this among the church that says, well, look, uh, pornography is no different than adultery. It's both lust. That's adultery. It qualifies for divorce. Therefore, if I catch my spouse doing this, well, no, they didn't physically cheat, but it doesn't matter because it's the same thing. Yeah. And without getting into the details of that, because we could get into it, but the idea was that we're going to make a parallel here because sin is sin. Well, sin is sin. But when you look under the law, you see plenty of examples where did all sin get treated the same way? No. The adulterer was stoned. The person who killed the ox of his neighbor was not stoned. There's different levels of severity, and anytime you have a law, that's what you're going to have. Now, when we're dealing with judgment, final judgment, we're not talking about a law anymore. We're talking about a pass fail. We're talking about are they in the book of life or not? And so I don't think that this is necessarily consistent with that idea. And I don't think that that's really what he's talking about. It goes back to how we read parables. And, if we read this really literally and make an analogy, well, okay, so as long as I don't eat and drink and get drunk and do things like that, and as long as I'm not beating the servants, I'm okay. Well, that's really not the point of it. The point is that he's doing what he's supposed to do and he's going to be blessed. He's not doing what he's supposed to do and he's not going to be blessed. And the reality is that the servant who, the point is not so much that the servant who didn't know got a lighter beating. The point is the servant who did know well, there was more expected of him. And I think that's the point that he's trying to make here. It's not about levels of punishment, I think, so much as it is about the idea that you have been given a job to do. And if you don't do it, you can't sit here and say, well, look, Peter can say, look, that rabble out there, they're not doing all this stuff. They aren't being as diligent as we, why are we expected to do more than them? And the answer is because you've been given more responsibility. And I think that's the point he's making, Dick. Um, I don't think so. I didn't read it that way. Yeah, yeah, and I think that's where, well, that's certainly true. And well, and actually, that's a really good example of what we're talking about here, because if you read the first three verses, the first three chapters of Romans, that's exactly what he says, right? You're without excuse. Now, did that mean that the Gentiles are going to hell light? No. He makes the point. You're all condemned, but you should have known better. You were given all the chances, and you should have known better. Well, does that mean I'm going to get punished more? No, but it does mean you have less excuse even. I can at least, when Jesus said it'd be more tolerable in the day of judgment for Sodom and Gomorrah, is he saying, well, Sodom and Gomorrah is going to get off? No, that's not the point. The point is, at least I kind of understand this, but how can you justify any of this? I think we understand pretty well that there's levels of of responsibility, levels of expectations from somebody because of what they have been given. I think that's all he's really trying to say here. You're going to have greater responsibility and you're going to have greater accountability. And to your point, how this is applied to the church, we think about all the things that we've been given and all the things, all the responsibilities and the expectations that are there for us. We can't look around comparing ourselves to other people and saying, well, they're not doing what I'm doing. Well, yeah, but were they given what you were given? Do they have the same charge that you were given? It's a great example, and to your point about Peter, Jesus telling Peter, Peter, you need to worry about yourself and not being worried about all these other people. Any comments or questions on that one? We're going to stop there because I'm out of time. I will finish up this section pretty briefly next week. Again, the reason I did not put dates on this is because I want to be able to cover everything as it needs to be covered. Gonna try not to belabor it, but we'll finish up this section and then we'll get into what did I say, Luke 15, and talk about seeking the lost. So thank you very much. We'll take a break.